Hello and welcome to today's Factel Daily. Welcome, Nick Hubble. How you doing, buddy?
Yeah, good to see you. They're just to update everyone on our weekly bank update. They're ripping out the foundations of the bank next door now. They've knocked down the building, but if you can hear a load of noise banging in the background, if the screen starts shaking because this house is a bit wobbly, it's because they're ripping out the bank's foundations next door.
Are they putting in earthquake rubber spring things to?
Well, they haven't
Or is that
started
just
rebuilding it
standard?
yet. They're still ripping out the old foundations. So they drill like a big hole and put big pylons in, and those have to be ripped out apparently. But yeah, this house is just so wobbly. It wobbles in the wind, it wobbles in the earthquakes, and now it's wobbling because the bank next door is getting ripped up.
Right. Well, maybe it'll wobble with the awesomeness of your piece today. So, talking of your piece, now you're discussing a fascinating analysis of a critical but often overlooked vulnerability in the global energy system: submarine power cables. Do you want to give us a little brief rundown of why you're focusing on that topic today?
Yeah, so about 4 or 5 months ago in July, I first started writing about this. The idea was that we were going to become reliant on subsea power cables. So these are high voltage cables moving electricity around countries, but also between countries, especially in Europe. And that the energy transition was making us reliant on those in two different ways. First of all, by transporting offshore wind energy to a shore, but more interestingly, the connections between countries. Basically, the green energy, renewable energy system is reliant on those. So if it's windy and sunny in one place but not in another, we can move the electricity very large distances in order to counteract for that. And this is how we fix the intermittency of renewables. The problem is that these cables have a habit of getting cut mysteriously, and we never quite find out by whom and how and what happened. And so nobody gets the blame. And this obviously creates some interesting geopolitical incentives, especially in the Baltic and in Europe, where countries can sabotage each other and get away with it. And the example of this was, of course, what happened with the gas pipeline with Nord Stream 1 and 2 that got damaged or blown up. And we still don't really quite know who did it. At least no one's getting the blame. No one's seeing any sort of significant consequences for it. And my argument was that this same phenomenon of gas pipelines getting damaged and undermining energy systems was going to play out on an even bigger scale in terms of subsea power cables. And it's not just power cables, it's also telecommunications cables and so on and so forth. All of this was my prediction a few months ago. That's all starting to happen now. That's playing out now in a very rapid way. So we've got power and telecoms cables getting damaged and cut in the Baltic for the most part. We don't quite know who's doing it. We don't quite know why. There's been some interesting raids by navies, European navies in the Baltic. In one case, a Chinese ship that was accused of damaging telecoms cables. But the point is that all of this,
the underground internet connection, right?
That's right. Yeah. So there's two different cables. Just the amount of cables being cut and damaged all the time is just incredible. And over the last few weeks, this has become a big international news story because the governments of the world are starting to realize what I wrote back in July, that subsea power cables are very vulnerable. So relying on them is probably a bad idea. And so they're starting to question whether they really want to be reliant on offshore wind energy and on these subsea cables between different countries. And what's happened is that Sweden recently rejected, I think it was 13 different offshore wind energy projects because of the vulnerability of the cables to the Russians. They specifically spoke about that. You had some NATO leaders pointing this out as well. And then about a week and a half ago, I think a Danish wind farm auction, so an auction to build wind farm projects for Denmark, went no bid. Nobody wanted to build it, which is similar to what happened in the UK a few months before. All of this, the dominoes are starting to fall in the precise way that we warned about it in July. Governments are starting to realize that they don't want these cables because of the vulnerabilities they create. And my prediction is that this is going to start hammering renewables companies, the companies building these cables and building these offshore wind farms. Their share prices are going to start to suffer as everyone starts to realize, and this has specifically happened in Sweden, that nuclear doesn't suffer from the same types of vulnerabilities. So it's a much better bet in terms of energy security.
Yeah, I was going to lead on to that one. That's what I found particularly interesting, was that how that vulnerability could force a fundamental shift in energy policy, potentially driving investment away from renewables and towards nuclear. Obviously, you highlight how submarine cable vulnerabilities are forcing a rethink of that whole infrastructure at the moment. But beyond the obvious pivot to nuclear, what other sectors or companies might, do you reckon, benefit from this assessment of energy security?
Yeah, everything that's getting shut down at the moment. So the coal, the gas, um, all of these industries that are supposed to be supplying the stopgap power to back up a renewable energy system, they'll benefit disproportionately because they're going to be used a lot more than expected, which is what we're seeing in Europe this winter already. So gas prices will be higher, coal prices will be higher. Plants that were expected to get shut down won't be. Plants that were shut down already might get refurbished, which is what we might see in Germany very soon with their nuclear power plants. So there's going to be a comeback, basically, of the sorts of energy forms that the renewables crowd don't like. Coal, nuclear, gas being the obvious
Actually, our
examples.
colleague Greg, sorry to interrupt, Nick. Our colleague Greg, he that's why he's been investing in and recommending coal stocks. 2 or 3 years ago, they looked so undervalued compared to renewable related investments, and they've done really, really well. UK had a near miss too, right? They've just admitted, or it's just come
The UK
out.
had
You
what,
wouldn't hear it
sorry?
on the mainstream press. The UK just had a near miss.
Yeah, that was a few months before. So one of the power cables between the UK and Norway was cut or was damaged. We don't know, and this almost caused a blackout. If there hadn't been a huge amount of gas capacity ready to back up the system, almost in an instant, within minutes, I think it was about 2 minutes, there would have been bad blackouts in the UK. So the UK is the most interesting story in all of this because it's so reliant on some of the longest power cables, subsea power cables in the world. One goes to Denmark and one to Norway. And these damage incidents are just happening incredibly regular. I think there's about 8 that were referred to in the article below this video on the Fat Tail Daily website. So the point is that it's no longer ignorable, right? Because the mainstream media is onto this now, they're going to start pressuring politicians. And I remember maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I interviewed Nigel Farage, and we almost as a joke came to the conclusion during the interview that coal is the best way to invest in the green energy transition because it's going to be such a disaster. And that's pretty much proven true since, and coal stocks have spiked several times since then. And the idea that you just pick what is unpopular in the news or in the mainstream media has, of course, a very long history, and it's been a very successful history. And I think that idea for fossil fuel energy has plenty of room to run, especially this northern winter and southern summer as our energy use spikes during periods when supply is so tight.
For those investors who might be heavily exposed to renewable energy in some form, but haven't yet really considered this situation, what practical approach would you suggest for those people now to rebalance portfolios?
Just rebalance gradually. I don't recommend any sort of panic selling. This is a pretty steady, continuous trend. My worry is for the people who they invested in these renewable ideas on the back of the fact that it's going to cost an absurd amount of money to achieve, right? The size of the investment boom that was promised for renewable energy and infrastructure was too big to be plausible. That was one of the conclusions that we reached in another piece. And so this was going to be a great investment trend, if only for the electricity grid that needed to get built for all these renewables. And I think those people need to start thinking about their exit strategy because that money might never get spent. That might never happen. All of that money might shift to nuclear. And I think there's a news story today that I saw this morning that the coalition government's proposing a huge shift in spending that was going to go towards the renewable sector into nuclear instead. I'm a bit skeptical about whether they'll actually ever deliver on that. But the point being that is what's happening around the world. There's a lot of, especially in Europe, but there's a lot of the world that's already figured out from experience, from a very, very hard experience and from extreme power prices, that they do need to make a change. And nuclear is going to take a hell of a long time, but it's fossil fuels that fill in the gap. So if you are heavily invested in renewables, now is the time to make the shift from their struggles and their failures across back to fossil fuels. And then at some point, there's going to be an opportunity in nuclear. But I don't quite know how to play that, which is what we've also discussed in previous videos.
You say that again, Nick? I missed you at the end there. You don't quite know.
I don't quite know the optimal way to do that,
right?
Whether it's small modular reactors or uranium or large-scale nuclear or the supply chain of the nuclear systems. There's so many different ways to play the nuclear power story. And they've all got their own sort of weaknesses and underlying flaws. And so I'm actually very much struggling to figure out which, because they're quite separate from each other, I'm struggling to figure out which particular sector to play or to focus on. So for example, I think a large-scale nuclear power plant is stuck, attached and connected to a grid that's failing for various different reasons. So I'm not so sure that's the best way to go, right? And government's not very good at building those, even ones that are, have had a track record of rolling them out. Small modular reactors might be the solution, might be the alternative there, because they offer individual and separate power, but they're not proven.
But that's also quite speculative at this stage, isn't it?
Exactly. So I'm sort of, I mean, at some point we should do a report into all the different possible ways that nuclear can be played. Another example is that the uranium supply it's quite likely that the uranium supply will expand quite significantly and very rapidly because of all the mothballed mines around the world that can be brought back online. So I'm not so sure that uranium is the best way to play it either, because the price could actually go down as supply over adjusts for demand, especially in the short term. So yeah, there's all these different angles that we need to figure out which one is the best for investors to play the nuclear story.
Well, why don't we just ask our viewers if you'd like us to do that for 2025? We'll put our resources behind it and start figuring out a few things. I think that'd be a really useful report. But yeah, it makes sense to me, just to finish up, Nick, that it's not a direct investment in nuclear for the near term. It's in those power sources that people actually need to cool their house in the summer and warm up their house in the winter, right? Yeah,
and that need has become the forefront of people's minds, just like bills did in 2022. I don't think people will tolerate a crunch in energy supplies. I think they'll tolerate having to shut off, or having the government shut off for them, their various appliances and things like that. So that's going to be the hard constraint the governments are going to bump into over this climate change issue. And I'm pretty confident that the politicians will lose that battle. The question is how and what they turn to instead. The idea that humans will constrain how much electricity or energy they use willingly seems pretty close to impossible to me, given our historical track record of needing ever more of everything, including energy.
Interesting. Right, report coming up. Well done, Nick. You just added another load of work to our plates, but it's good work. We'll see you very soon. Well, next week we're switching up the schedule a little bit, right? I'm going to be talking to you on Tuesday, I believe, rather than next Friday, ahead of the Christmas break. So I'll speak to you then. Have a great weekend. Thanks for tuning in to FatTel Daily. If you're ready to take a new approach to building wealth, avoiding the same old mainstream ideas and investigating new market trends, then make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you don't miss a single video. And as a thank you, we've got a free report just for you. It is packed with actionable insights that show you how to capitalize on an alternative investment idea that you'll unlikely find anywhere else. You can download it right now by clicking on the link in the description below. So, if you're ready to discover strategies that the traditional market just doesn't offer, grab your free report. Until next time.